Further, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on traditional Aboriginal land, and we should acknowledge the contribution of the Aboriginal people to our society, both in the past and currently. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Rhiannon. Rhiannon was elected as the first, with Ian Cohen, as the first Member of Parliament, Greens Member of Parliament in New South Wales in 1991. 1999. 1999, sorry. She has been a tireless campaigner for social justice, for workers' rights, women's rights, overdevelopment, political donations, transport, and of course environmental protection. And I think we're very lucky that she could spare some time in her incredibly hectic schedule to address us today. So I'll hand over to Lee.
First off, do I need the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, definitely have the microphone. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Look, partly why we're gathered here today is obviously to consider the issue of climate change, but it clearly is in the context of the federal election. So I think it is worth remembering the lead up to the last federal election, because in many ways it was the first climate change election, and it was something that we felt passionate about, and there was that moment, many moments of excitement, and particularly in this area, when the John Howard government was defeated, and many of us felt that there was such a clear mandate that that government came in with to act on climate change. And I do meetings all over the state and to some extent over the country, mainly within New South Wales. And in recent months, the disappointment with regard to the lack of action on climate change is something that I'm picking up more and more. It's quite intense. Some people are angry, some people are disappointed, some people very cynical about the political process, which is something I have to say disappoints me, because when people become cynical about the political process, they don't engage. And what's so important in our democracy is that we all engage. I believe that that's something really, really fundamental to how our society works. Firstly, you get better outcomes when you have people involved. There's nothing like the collective mind when you're there trying to work on solutions to come up with good solutions. So that's something that I think we need to acknowledge is very much part of what we're dealing with here. But I did want to speak to you in terms of what's happened in recent years about climate change policy in this country, how the Greens handled it, and what we're taking into this election campaign. So the big showcase policy that the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd put forward was the carbon pollution reduction scheme. Now, in the early stages, the Greens, because our own policy is for an emissions trading scheme, we considered, obviously, very carefully supporting that scheme. Our 5 senators, Senator Bob Brown and the rest of the Green senators, obviously very closely assessed what the policy was that was brought forward. The difficulty our Green senators had, and if you remember where we were at, this is a couple of years ago, wasn't just that Kevin Rudd was the leader of the government, it was Malcolm Turnbull who was the leader of the opposition. And why I mention that is because the whole nature of the debate was very different. Labor believed that they had the numbers because Malcolm Turnbull was a clear supporter of a carbon pollution reduction scheme, so therefore it would go through. It would go through in time for the big Copenhagen international meeting on climate change, and Mr Rudd as Prime Minister would be able to take his scheme to that conference. Now we all know what happened. Why I mention that is to explain why Labor did not negotiate with the Greens over the carbon pollution reduction scheme. So although we had various proposals as that scheme under the Climate Change Minister Penny Wong involved, we had many proposals on how it should change. They did not engage with us. And that was obviously very difficult. And why they didn't engage with us, because they thought they had the numbers. And they did have the numbers there for quite a period until Malcolm Turnbull was rolled. Now, the significance of that is that our senators are there working on not just not on their own. They're not able to work with the Labor government, working with a whole range of environment groups on the amendments that should be put forward. It's at that time that they determine that they have to vote against the scheme. Now, people have been critical of the Greens, and it's good for us to hear those criticisms of why we have voted against the scheme. And as I mentioned, I do meetings across the state, and it's interesting how similar the question is often asked. And that question is, okay, it's not a good scheme, but something is better than nothing. Why didn't you vote for it? So that's what I would like to address, that the scheme wasn't something. It was a bad scheme that would have, if it had passed, would have resulted in a setback to dealing with climate change. And let's remember, it was Kevin Rudd himself who said, when he was Prime Minister, this is the great moral issue of our time that we have to deal with. And then, within a year, it's a policy that's dumped for another 3 years. So our senators look at it very closely. They put up about 22 amendments to try and get it on track. Senator Christine Milne is recognised as the leading senator on climate change, with an in-depth knowledge of how all this works. Her and her team gave very close attention to it. They determined that the Greens would have been irresponsible in voting for it, as I said, because it would have been a setback. Why would it have been a setback? Well, firstly, the target itself is only 5%. But again, people will say to me, something is better than nothing. Now, why we're saying that it wasn't something, it was actually a negative that would have been a setback, is because largely, there's a few reasons, but the big reason is because of the compensation it would have generated for the fossil fuel industry. Billions of dollars would have had to have been paid out under this scheme to the fossil fuel industry. Under the scheme that was proposed when Malcolm Turnbull was Leader of the Opposition, there was already some compensation. Do you remember that Malcolm Turnbull then puts up amendments, and those amendments are then accepted by the Labor government, and that even resulted in higher payouts, quite seriously, to the level of billions of dollars. So that's bad enough. So we're at the point now of about $16 billion payout in compensation to the fossil fuel industry at the 5% target. Our Green senators then get legal advice that if the target was increased, that's the target at which we would need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which you would have to think it would, because 5% is so inadequate and it's very urgent to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to ensure that there is a limit placed on the rise in temperatures. So what happens is that we then get the advice that if the government chooses to increase the temperature that it wants to increase the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that it wants to reduce the overall Australian contribution by, it would trigger even greater payout. So we're then up to more than $20 billion in compensation to the fossil fuel industry, largely the coal industry in this country. So what does that mean? That means not just a failed scheme, but a destructive scheme that would be robbing the public purse of that money that is urgently needed for the renewable energy industry, to drive the renewable energy industry, the energy efficiency schemes, the smart grids, that is all part of that overall planning that we need to move to zero emissions, or at least a low carbon economy. So that was where our Green senators, and I did want to assure you that they made really detailed examination of the scheme to determine what our position should be, and determined that they should vote against it. So that brings us up to the end of last year. So by October, the scheme's fallen over, probably November. I think ABBA came in October. And December, was it that late? Ah, thank you. So it's at the end of the year, the scheme falls over, because Abbott, as you remember, comes in on the rise. Any scheme is terrible. You remember all the sensational arguments that he put forward. It's just a big tax, we have to vote against it. Now that's just popularism. It's all about him trying to carve out votes. It's certainly not any sincerity about the issue. And I think it's also worth remembering that under the former Prime Minister John Howard, they did have plans for their own emissions trading scheme. So it's not as though it's something alien to Liberal policy. But what Abbott identified was that there was some uncertainty